It is now my honor to invite Mr. Omar Ndizeye to share his story with us. Mr. Ndizeye is a child survivor of the genocide and the author of Life and Death in Nyamata, memoir of a young boy in Rwanda's darkest church. As a young boy, he was among the very few who survived the mass killings at Nyamata Catholic Church during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi. Having witnessed the loss of so many family members, Omar decided to dedicate his life to peace building. Mr. Ndizeye, we are humbled by your presence. You have the floor.
Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkil, the President of 75th Session of the United Nations General Assembly, Your Excellency, Mrs. Valentine Rugwabiza, Permanent Representative of the Republic of Rwanda to the United Nations, Your Excellencies, fellow Rwandans, and friends of Rwanda. As introduced, my name is Omar Ndizeye, a survivor of the 1994 genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda. Before I continue, allow me to express my gratitude for this opportunity to share with you a story of my days in darkness of the genocide, when my beloved father, a young brother, and 45 members of my family lost lives in the cruelest death. Today is a day of humanity reflection, a day we remember the victims of the genocide against Tutsi, to understand what happened when human beings lost empathy. For survivors like me, this is a day of grief, a day of loss, a day of mourning. It reminds us humiliation, dehumanization, starvation, rape, and the cruel death in which our own died in the lane days from April to July 1994. Oh, let's exterminate them. Interahamwe Hutu militias used to sing while hunting down Tutsis on the hills, swamps, rivers, and the lakes of Rwanda, with intention to leave none of them to tell their story. Born from a family which lived in a refugee camp of Nyamata in 1959 to 1961, after their deportation from north to southeast of Rwanda in a region called Bugesera, story of my family reflects long-term persecution of Tutsis from 1959 to 1992. Besides Tutsi pogroms of 1960s and the 4 years prior to the genocide, many of them were killed by pneumonia, hunger, cholera, tsetse fly, and many other diseases in those refugee camps. Your Excellencies, today's remembrance is also about the cruelty of the genocide. It's about unspeakable barbaric death in which victims died. For me, it's about the 2 days massacres at the Nyamata church. It's about the life and death in Nyamata, as the title of my first book says. On 15th April 1994, when Interahamwe entered the church of Nyamata, supported by the former government army, it was deadly and horrific. Tear gas, intense shootings, grenades blast had already turned the church into a bloodbath site. It was a mixture of us who were still alive, dead bodies, and the parts of human flesh spread around by endless grenades blast. Interahamwe slaughtered Tutsis who were still alive inside the church by cutting their necks using machetes, crushing their heads using the wooden club. It was barbaric, cruel, and painful. These notorious killers left the church later in the evening after killing young babies by throwing them at the church walls. When I came out of that bloody river under the church benches where it was covered partly by dead Tutsis, their blood and parts of their bodies, jumping over them was the only way to get out of this church, which is now a memorial. Before I left the church, I stopped at the body of my father. He was at the top of hundreds dead Tutsis. His backbone was almost in two pieces. That was my last image of him. My young brother, together with other relatives, all of them perished in the church of Nyamata. Surviving the human butchery of Nyamata was not the end of these terrible days, but rather it was the start of living without soul, dying every day, as our life expectancy was only 1 minute. On the second day, on 16th April 1994, the massacre of Nyamata Convent and Sunday School were bloodshed, full of unseen cruelty. Hundreds of Interahamwe had come early this time. Guns, grenades were no longer scary anymore. By cutting Tutsis into small pieces, by starting from parts of their heads, had no words to describe these brutal killings and how painful it was. Your Excellencies, we need to remember the pain of women during the genocide against Tutsi, that it needs its own research to give them enough justice. Because the image of this pregnant woman brought to the killing site, where I was standing waiting my turn to be killed, will never leave my mind. I remember her crying, asked two Interahamwe to forgive her by telling them that the child in her womb was a Hutu. Oh, don't worry. We are going to remove our child safely, but you deserve to die. This killer responded. Do you feel her pain? When they start to butcher her using machetes, how her screaming, her most painful death, had nothing else to be compared with. As I was hiding behind the crowd of hopeless Tutsis whose soul had already gone because their death was a matter of minutes, I climbed the fence to find myself behind the human butchery of Nyamata. I never called this a miracle, but a God's mission to tell what happened in that closed monastery. The following days in the forest and the bushes surrounding Nyamata turned the lane days into castles of sorrow, as it was the only time that hunters of humans would take a break. Our life had lost a meaning until RPF Inkotanyi liberated Bugesera on 13th May 1994. Your Excellencies, dear friends, this horrific past which tasted humanity, still calling us to understand the history of genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, reminds us to create safe spaces for healing and dealing with genocide consequences. The step made by UN to designate this International Day of Reflection on Genocide Against Tutsi was a justice to the victims. It was a restoration of trust to the humanity. It is a sign of refusing indifference of those who diminish the pain we suffered. Because by doing so, you refuse to suppress the names of the victims. By doing so, you refuse to whitewash the perpetrators. As Mahmoud Mamdan once said, we may agree that genocidal violence cannot be understood as irrational, yet we need to understand it as thinkable. Rather than run away from it, we need to realize that it is the popularity of the genocide that is a uniquely troubling aspect. End of quote. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, for me to stand in front of you today as a young child who survived the genocide is a long step made. It's a proof of the truth of horror we faced. There are not enough words to thank you in the name of other survivors, that you chose the truth over denial. As I conclude, I want to share my hope from my journeys of life. A hope because I believe in everyone here today that denial of the genocide against Tutsi shall never exist without challenges. It's a hope and gratitude for those who refuse to be bystanders and risk their lives to liberate us, to rescue us, those who lost lives while resisting and stopping the genocide. Our reflection today is also about them. Let today be a day of turning never again into reality, where racism and genocide denial remain only in the books of history. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Ndizeye, for your moving testimony recounting the terrible acts that unfolded in Rwanda just 27 years ago. The horrors of the trauma are unimaginable to bear, especially when witnessed as a child. Hearing your story strengthens our joint resolve to stand up to ideologies of hate. This resolve, together with the message of resilience and hope that your journey gives us, is the inspiration we will take with us today.